In this video, we are going to design a survey form for a pizzeria to collect customers' information and their perception of the service quality of the restaurant. We will be using web form and various controls to get customers' input. So far, all of the websites we have created have been static, allowing users to see the information, but users couldn't interact with the web page. In this project, we are going to use web forms to create interactive web pages that can receive users' data. In next videos, we will go over JavaScript to develop dynamic web pages. A web form is an object in web development that can contain different controls such as input box, radio button, selection list, and text area. These controls allow users to interact with the web page. Here's the survey form we are going to design in this project. It contains various elements such as field set for customer information and customer experience. Each of these field sets contain some other elements like input box to enter name, street address, city, state, postal code, phone number. We have selection list to select one option among multiple available options. We have other controls like a spin box, checkbox, calendar control to enter the date, and option box or radio button. And we have some other controls like text box area, slide control, and etc. So each of these controls should be associated with a data variable. These variables will be sent to server for further processing. So user interface or web form is like an interface between user and a server. The user interface or web form collects users' information and put them in a data variable, and then later on send them to the server for further processing. So for each of these boxes that receive users input, we must define a variable, and then on the server these values are going to be paired with the data variable. So now I'm going to go ahead and get started with the project. Here's the main web page. We are going to add a web form at the bottom of this paragraph. This is going to be a kind of survey. So I'm going to right click and open it with Notepad++. We have some other files. So here is the HTML file, the main HTML file, and in this folder we have some other files like rbform_txt, which is a CSS file that determines the appearance of the web page. This file has already been designed, and we have another file rbformSubmit, which is a JavaScript file that takes the input from users and then send them to the server. So for this step we are not going to go through these two files. What we're going to do is just link these two files to our main project. First, the CSS file to change the appearance of our web page, and this JavaScript file which handles transferring information to a server. So now I'm going to go into the head section and link the CSS file to our main HTML file, href equals rb forms, the line txt dot css, and its type is style sheet. The next file is the JavaScript, so I'm going to add script to our metadata. Okay, so its source equals rb form submit. rb form submit dot javascript. Okay. So we have defined our metadata for this web page. Now I'm going to go to this part at the bottom of this paragraph and then add a form to my web page. With this tag, with form, we can define a web form in our HTML file. So I'm going to set its attributes. First is the ID attribute. I'm going to set it to survey, and we have to set some other attributes to be able to handle this form correctly. First is the action attribute. This attribute determines the URL of the web server which receives the data of this web page. So here we have to set the IP address of the server. I'm going to use a kind of fictional URL for this project, www.example.com Red Ball Pizza and then survey form. The next attribute that we have to set is the method. Method determines how data of a web form is going to be sent to the server. There are two options. First is the get. By get, all of the information collected on the form is going to be added to the end of the URL. This is not a secure way to transmit information to the server, because hackers may see this information halfway through their destination. So the next option is the post, which is more secure. So I'm going to use this option. Here in this project, we have two sets of controls. First, collect customer information, their personal information like their name, street address, state postal code. And the second part collects customers' experience at Red Ball Pizza. So they're divided into two parts, and each in a control called field set. One field set for customer information and one for get your experience at Red Ball Pizza. So I'm going to define a field set, actually two field sets. I'm going to set its ID to customer info for the first field set, info, and for the second field set, I'm going to set its ID to experience info, exp info, and then ending tag for the field set. Save, go to the web page, refresh. So here we have two field set in one form. Now we have to set some attributes for the field sets. This is the legend. Customer information is the legend, which is kind of a label for this container, and it is placed in the top left corner of each field set. So in this project, for each field set, I have to define legend. So the first legend is going to be customer information, and for the second field set, the legend is going to be share your experience at Red Ball Pizza. Save, go to the web page and refresh. Okay, so we have legend for these two field sets. So now we have to define these fields and populate our field sets with these controls. For this project, we are going to add these controls from name to email address, and in the next project we will go over other controls for this project. So first we will start with name, street address. Inside the first field set, after the legend, I'm going to define a box to receive users input, and then I'm going to define a name to store users input, and I'm going to set its name to customer name. As I mentioned earlier, this name is the place where users input are going to be stored on the server. So it's very important to define this attribute for any input. And then ID for identifying these controls, and then reference them in CSS files. I'm going to set it to name, and its last attribute, which is text. And this is a one-sided tag. So here we have an input box, and next to the input box we have a kind of label. So before the input text, I'm going to define a label, and I'm going to link it with the next control, with the input control. So I'm going to set its for attribute to the ID of the next control, to name. So this way, this label is going to be linked to the name input, and its label is name with the star, meaning that it is required to enter a value in that field. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the survey form, refresh. Here we have name star, and this is the input box to receive customers input. And I'm going to add required to the end of input box to make users enter a value in this field, because name is a required field. To better organize each pair of label and input, I'm going to put them in a div tag, and I'm going to set its class to form row. Form row. So go to the form, refresh. Okay. This is required to enter a value in this form. So now we can add other elements: street address, city, state. So I'm going to just copy this div and all elements inside div, and add new elements to the form. So the next one is the street address. This is not required, so I'm going to define customer its name, customer address, its ID, customer street, its ID to street, its type again is text, and it is not required. So the for must match the ID of the next element, which is a street. Save, and then go back to the web form, refresh. Here we get the street address. So now we have to add other elements: city, city, I'm going to change it, the name to customer city, and its type to text. Save, and then go back to the form. So we get the city. The same for state. Change this label to state. The name of the field value to customer state. state, and it's type to text. And we can also um, define some default values for these fields. For example, for state, we can limit our survey form to states like Florida. So by defining the value attribute, we can define default values, for example, to Florida. Save. So here we have the Florida because we defined the value attribute for this form. Now we have to define the postal code. Or zip code. I'm going to set it to zip, customer zip, postal code, its ID to zip, type, and I'm going to define some form of placeholder. Placeholder defines the correct format of the data that must be entered in a control like text box. So I'm going to define this format, 5 characters and then 4 characters. Go back to the web form. Here we have postal code, and here we have the placeholder. It tells the customers how to put their information in the correct format. And now we have to define the phone number, phone number, I'm going to define it to phone, its name to customer phone, and its type for phone number must be changed to tel, not text. And again, I can define a placeholder for the correct, to help users enter the correct format. Free numbers, again 3 dash and 4 numbers. And the last item is going to be the email address. Email, and it is again, it's required customer email, its ID must change to email, its type for email must be email, not text, and it is required. Save, go to the web form, refresh. So here we have these items. Now I'm going to add 2 buttons to submit and reset the web form. At the bottom of the field set, I'm going to define a div tag, going to set its ID to buttons, and with this command, with input and type submit, we can define a button, and I'm going to change its value to submit form, and another button for to reset the form. So its type is going to be reset, value cancel the form or reset the form. Save, go to the web form, refresh. So here we have two buttons, submit form and cancel. So let's change submit form to just submit. Okay. So now I'm going to, these two fields are required, name and email. I'm going to leave it blank. Go to other forms like street address, Miami, Florida, for the phone number 25, and I'm not going to enter anything in the email address. So because this field is required, we have to enter something in this field like Jerry Cox, and I'm going to enter some form of address. Let's see if that works. Since it was defined as an email, we must enter email in the correct format. Okay. Submit form. So now it has collected all of the information entered in this web form, and it wants to send this to the server. If we define a kind of correct server address, all of the information are going to be sent to the correct server, and the cancel will reset the form. So in this project, we defined a web form and then two field sets for this form to organize the elements, first for the customer information and then for the customer experience. We have learned how to define input text box and set different type of conditions for this input box, how to define buttons, and how to define placeholder and default value for this project. In the next project, we're going to we will design a new field set with new elements like calendar, color picker, and to collect customers' experience of the quality of service at this pizzeria. So now I'm going to close this video. In the next video, we will go over the next part of the project.